You're tuned in to Ask the Master Auto Technician. Car questions? Get answers right now. Call 850-763-0555.
James Auto Center, we fix it right, guaranteed. Beep, 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 yeah.
All right, good morning. This is Friday morning's edition of Ask the Master Auto Technician. Every Friday I talk to Hansson Hindenburg. I like calling him that because he's a very handsome young man, and he's every bit of 35 years old now. Is that right, Hansson?
Yeah, sure.
I
started working here when I was, 12?
Well, didn't you?
Yeah, feels like it a lot of days.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about is air ride suspension, or just suspension in general. That seems to be the biggest thing out there that people seem to take for granted until they start having problems with tire wear or excessive noise, or the height of the car is dropped where they're riding on the on the bumpers on the ground, so to speak. We've all seen those cars. And and when you tell them what it's going to cost to replace it with air ride suspension back to original equipment, they get this sticker shock. But there's also an option out there that I don't know if you've dealt with it, where you replace the air ride suspension with mechanical suspension, solid coil springs instead of the air springs, or I don't know if you've had any experience with that or
We've done quite a few,
okay. Tell me about it.
on Lincoln's, both the Lincoln Navigator that had some of the air ride suspension,
right.
And of course the Lincoln Town Car, which we've done tons of.
Well, tell me about your experience with what seems to be the pros and cons. That's what I wanted to get, because we talked about this earlier, and I want to.
To me, I think one is as good as the other, but I've had customers tell me that they've done it on another vehicle and they thought that the ride was a little bit stiffer, which makes sense because you're riding on two air pillows if you have, the airbag suspension on the Lincoln Town Car, and that they rather go back with the original equipment.
You know what? I've heard that as well. Excuse me. People had the air ride. They'll put the mechanical on because it's just a fraction of the cost. If you just put mechanical on there, you're talking about spending, $400, something like that, parts and labor, and that's somewhere in that area. And if you have to put the air spring on there, by the time you put the new compressor on, it always goes bad, and the new air springs on it, and you put all the solenoids in it, you could have a $1,200, $1,500 bill very, very easily. And people don't want to do that. Then they put the mechanical on there. Then they have what you said, buyer's remorse. Go, man, if I paid an extra, $1,000 more, I'd have a wonderful, smooth ride.
Well, and you hit upon it. Anytime you start replacing the airbags, make sure you put a new pump in there, because we've done it many times before, and then 2 weeks down the road, of course, that pump that's been in there for 100,000 miles as well just decides it doesn't want to pump anymore.
One of the things that I found out, and I found this out years ago, was we put one in, and we just changed the air springs because the compressor worked. Wasn't drawing too many amps. Didn't think anything about it. Gave it to the customer. He came back the next day. You remember when you were a kid and you jacked up the rear end of a car, like a race car? Well, that's what there's a vent solenoid on the compressor. For the last 5 years, this thing's been venting on its own without that vent solenoid working, so it froze up. It never worked, so it just kept pumping the car up and never would let it vent to go back down again. So they came in here jacked up about 2 feet in the air, and they asked what happened. I said, I think I know what your problem is. We're going to have to change your compressor. And they go, really? I go, yep. And since that time, I never change air springs without quoting a compressor, because if you don't, you know what I'm talking about, they'll end up biting you in the hiney. And customers don't like it when they have to come back a second time. But the air ride, like you said, is a much better ride. It's a much softer ride, and it gives you the luxury ride that you bought the car for.
Well, and you say luxury ride, people won't ever think about it. Mercedes and Land Rovers have air ride suspension in quite a few of their vehicles, too.
Yeah, they do.
And you talk about a $1,500 expense on the Lincoln Town Car. You're talking about 3 times that much, unfortunately, on the Land Rover,
or
depending on what it needs and what's wrong with the vehicle.
Yep, yeah. Customers, they go into a sticker shock when they bring in their 10-year-old Mercedes, and you say, yes, sir, you have a problem with your right front air spring over here. It needs to be replaced, and it's recommended you change them in pairs. And they say, oh, okay, how much is that going to cost? $2,600. Oh my God, and I go, be thankful you don't own a Corvette. And they look at me and go, what? And I go, Corvettes are even more expensive. The brand new Corvettes out there are Now, they're not air ride, but they're a magnetic type suspension where those shocks are like $1,000 a piece. You know what I'm talking about?
We've done it like on some of the Tahoes, and even the Chevy Suburbans have those as well.
And they're expensive. People don't realize that. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this. But how important is that suspension ride to keeping those tires from wearing out prematurely?
Well, a lot of, and we see a lot of cars now with 150,000 miles on there. They've never changed the struts.
Never.
And they go, well, it's making noise, but also I can feel it. It's really squirmy, and you just put those new tires on there. I thought that would fix it. And we go, well, it really needs new struts, and you might as well do the whole assembly with the new plate on top also the new springs, because if you just do the strut itself, a lot of times the noises don't go away.
That's what I tell people. They come in here and say, well, how much does the struts cost? I say, do you want me to sell you what you just think you want or what you need? And they go, well, what do I need? And I said, you need the struts, you need the springs, and you need actually the plates on the top. If you don't, I hear my dog barking in the background. If you don't do that, you're going to end up having a lot of problems down the road.
Well, and usually people complain about the noise, but the wear and tear also has a lot to do on the tires. We see a lot of cupping, and the alignment is fine, but the way that the suspension moves makes the tire kind of flop around, and then it gets funny cupped wear. And also, of course, the stopping distance is changed, and people don't realize that.
What did they say? Is it 10? With good struts and shocks, you can stop 10% faster, or is it more than that? I think it's at least 10% faster.
At least 10%. Sometimes, I've seen some of the graphs from like Monroe that say about 25 to 30%, depending on how worn the struts are.
Well, a lot depends on your tires, and if you have tires that are chopped up, or you don't have a lot of rubber left on them, and it's slightly wet, and your struts are bad, those are 3 strikes against you right there if you're in a panic stop, or panic situation, because it is not going to work like it's supposed to. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about this, because a lot of people don't think twice about putting tires on every 3 or 4 years. But when the car gets 75 to 100,000 miles on, and you mention, hey, you need struts on this, they go, oh, that's a lot of money. And I said, but if you want the tires to last.
And people complain about the ride comfort, and if you plan on keeping the car for 60, 70 more thousand miles, I'd always recommend that you around 100,000 miles. They recommend sooner than that, but at least at 100,000 miles, do the struts and the shocks.
You're okay. Now we're still on suspension right here. I talked earlier this week about cars that have no grease fittings in, and I was telling people even trucks don't have grease fittings, but they have places that you can put grease fittings in. How it's so important before you buy a used car or even a new car, if you have those fittings in there, to have the manufacturer put grease fittings in there, because it'll save you money in the long run. Do you concur, or do you disagree, or do you?
Absolutely. Well, and a lot of times we're looking at I'm sorry, I'm still on shocks. We're looking at ball joints and tie rod ends, and they're actually improved designs. If you cut them in half, they've changed how they were designed from OE. So they're actually better. They perform better than what the original equipment did. It's pretty amazing sometimes if you look at the cutaway about how much engineering the aftermarket community has put into making the product better.
Well, they're doing that because they're expecting it to last longer than to get out of warranty. Where the manufacturer's interest is just get it through warranty. Will it make it through warranty? But a lot of these old tie rod ends or ball joints have the little Zerk fitting plug that can come out, and you can put a new plug in, put a grease fitting or Zerk fitting in is the proper name, to be able to grease the ball joints between oil changes. But when you take a car, when a car comes in here from an oil change that I haven't seen before, and they may have grease fittings on them, where someone's put them on there, but they never get grease. It seems like when people change oil on cars, they do not grease front-end suspensions anymore because it's almost non-existent. grease fittings on cars.
Well, and you know, you and I know that, and when I'm out there sometimes with the techs, and I say, hey, you need to check the front end. That particular car has a couple of grease fittings on there, like lower ball joints on some of these vehicles, and also the drive shaft is neglected a lot of times.
Good point. Good point. That is.
You know, people go, well, you know, the drive shaft probably is a lot of cars. Yes, all the U joints are sealed, but we were looking at cars that have 150,000 miles on there. Somebody has replaced those U joints, and 9 times out of 10, the U joints that were replaced with have grease fittings on it, and they need to be.
Absolutely. One of the things I do find out, speaking on grease fittings, one of the things I preach to my guys before they change a U-joint, to take the cups out on the brand new U-joint and fill them full of grease. Because you and I both know, even if you put a grease fitting on there and you put a grease gun on there, there's no guarantee you're going to get a grease in each cup unless you manually put it in there before you stick it together. And that way it saves that car coming back in a year's time from me having to do that U-joint over again. But I learned that lesson when I was a kid.
And you know, my recommendation if we're talking about trucks is, you know, replace the entire control arm. You get the control arm bushings, you get a new ball joint, and some of the, especially on some of the vehicles, the actual control arm is re-engineered to have a much stronger and more stable ride than the old one did. They just kind of made a flimsy control arm, like you said earlier, to last about 36,000 miles. And then it kind of warps itself almost sometimes.
Dodge product trucks is one I can think of that do that, and some Ford trucks. Is there one you can think of right off the top of your head?
Ford and Dodge are the main ones, and also some of them, you know, they do make ball joints for, I've seen on the Ford Mustang, but the lower control arm is so flimsy. Once you put a new ball joint in there, it just really is not quite right. It doesn't fit in there quite right. So I always recommend, you know, changing the entire control arm.
We call that NQR, not quite right. It's NQR. It's not quite right. And that's one of the things out there. Hey, Hansson, I want to thank you for getting on here because you explained to people, because when I try to explain to people about this, they kind of look at me going, you know, I've never heard anyone talk about grease fittings being put in and all this. I'm going, hey, that's just the way things are.
In our industry, we have to be careful. We always wind up, you know, thinking that the customer already knows about it, and we want to show them and explain it to them. And a lot of times that makes a difference. A light bulb goes up and goes, yeah, that makes sense. That's what we're here for.
Save, you know, put a little money, you know, pay me a little now or pay me a lot later. And that's what you and I are trying to do, is get you to spend a little money proactively to where you don't have to spend a lot more money down the road to get something major fixed by just doing a little preventive maintenance. It's head and shoulders to make sure your car lasts you 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 miles. All right, thank you so much, Hansson. We'll be talking to you later. And
have a great week. Thank you.
873-8900.
James Auto Center, we fix it right, guaranteed. Beep, beep.